Welcome back. Let's now proceed with panel discussion 6, titled Unlocking Opportunities in Emerging Markets. This session will be moderated by Dr. Kenji Shibuya, CEO, Medical Excellence Japan. Our panelists are Ms. Geetali Kumar, Head of Venture Capital and Disruptive Technology Investments, East Asia and Pacific International Finance Corporation. Ms. Denya Lingard, CEO, The Commons Project Foundation. Mr. Daniel Tian, Associate Director, Leapfrog Investments. And Ms. Maria Rabnovich, Founder, Co-CEO, FlareRescue.co. Now, Dr. Shibuya, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this panel on unlocking healthcare opportunities in emerging economies. I'm Kenji Shibuya, CEO of Medical Excellence Japan. MSA is a public-private partnership that promotes Japan's high-quality technology and services globally, especially in emerging economies. But also, we also support medical tourism by bringing patients, doctors, and investment to Japan with the broader goal of transforming healthcare into a key growth industry. Now, as many of you know, the US and other established economies, health and biotech investment landscape is currently in a holding pattern, meaning many investors are executives in wait-and-see mode. In contrast, there is a growing optimism and momentum and healthcare development in emerging markets, where the pace of innovation, investment interest, and system reform is picking up. Yet, despite this optimism, a long-standing narrative persists that these regions are constrained by insufficient funding, underdeveloped infrastructure, and on top of that, workforce shortages. Is that still true today? This session challenges that assumption. We shift the focus from limitations to opportunities. Innovation, entrepreneurship, and new partnership are actively redefining healthcare across the global south. So let's explore together how bold thinking, rooted in local context and powered by global collaboration, can deliver real and lasting change. With that in mind, let's begin the conversation. So our first speaker, we want to make it interactive as much as we can, but Getty, who is the head of venture capital and disruptive technology investment at IFC, will share her idea to kick out this panel. So, floor is yours.
Thank you. So I did have a few quick slides. I don't know. Okay, perfect. So I'm Gitali. Hi, nice to meet all of you. Good morning. I work with the IFC, which is the International Finance Corporation. We are part of the World Bank Group. And essentially, what we do is we invest in private companies across emerging markets globally. And actually, Japan is probably our second largest shareholder. So this is essentially the money of 180 countries that are pooled together to invest in emerging markets across the world. So this is just a few sort of brief summary slides that I prepared just to give you an overview of what we do. We are the largest global DFI, as I said, investing in emerging markets. We have 100 plus offices across the world, including one in Tokyo. And yeah, since we were founded, we've invested about $325 billion. This year, we are expecting to invest $50 billion across the world in debt as well as in equity. So I'm particularly part of our disruptive technology and venture capital team, and I sort of lead our investments for Asia. Actually, we are the first DFI to have set up a dedicated venture capital sort of department and to do investments in venture and technology innovations. We do both. We invest in funds. So we've invested in about 93 venture capital funds across the globe, through which we get access to more than 2,000, I would say, early stage companies. We also invest directly into startups. So we have invested in about 120 startups globally, 30 of which are already unicorns. And these are across sectors, right? So we don't just do healthcare, even though healthcare is a huge focus for us. We invest across the technology spectrum. So in things like agriculture, education, supply chain, software, and all of that. But if I was to just focus on healthcare, we have deployed more than $11 billion in healthcare globally. We clearly see that there is a huge gap between the demand and supply in emerging markets. And I think by investing in healthcare services, in life sciences, in medical devices in these areas, we hope that we can bridge that gap between the demand and supply in emerging markets. So particularly our health tech practice, as you can see here, we are looking to do, investments in all kind of three areas, I would say, in services, medical technology, and life sciences. Uh, and this is just a quick summary of what we've done so far in health tech particularly. So we've invested in about 15 companies globally, $70 million invested across these companies. Some examples that you can see here are like Kera, which is a AI company for health in Senegal. MedGenome is a genetic testing company in India. Nephroplus again is a dialysis chain in India. So these are the kind of investments we do. And we've also invested in about 110 VC funds, as I was mentioning, two of which are dedicated health tech specific funds, and the others are more generic funds, but they focus on health tech as well. So that's just a quick summary, and then yeah, we can go into specific
Excellent.
questions.
So just a quick, just beginner's question, but you, IFC invest public money into private sector, right, as a kind of BC. But there are so many private BCs around the world. What distinguishes you, IFC, from the rest of the BC?
The fact that we take very long to close investments.
I
No,
see.
joking.
That's important.
That's very important. But no, I think we are very different from the usual VCs. First of all, we're investing out of our balance sheet. So we are much more patient capital, long-term capital. We don't have this pressure to invest and exit like a fund. So I think that gives us more perspective to think about long-term strategy. What do we invest in? We can stay invested with you for 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, right? So we don't have this sort of rush to invest and exit. Secondly, we bring years and decades of experience doing healthcare. So we kind of understand what models work in, let's say, US, what models work in Japan, and then we kind of apply it to many other markets. Right? We have people in our team who are, experienced in healthcare for the last 50, 60 years, and they sort of support the investment teams as we go along making investment decisions. And they come in and work with these portfolio companies even after we invest. And then I would say that the fact that we have global networks with governments, we have global networks with local municipalities. So we also get into regulation, and we also get into working with governments in these markets to sort of open up areas, right? So to give you an example, we're talking about how, let's say, InsurTech should have, with the Indonesian government, for instance, like how do we make this more regulated? How should we bring in more interesting products that we can work with the government healthcare schemes? So these are the kind of things we also do in addition to just investing.
Wonderful. I want to ask one more question before going to the next speaker. But which areas in healthcare, like drug R&D, diagnostics, primary care, digital health, or even age tech, are showing the most traction in your investment portfolio?
Actually, different markets will show different levels of interest in each of these, right? So I think in a market like where you have a more aging population, longevity is a huge topic. How do you take care of people when they're becoming older? Elder care homes, technology to support elderly care people. Let's say even providing home care. So we see that a lot in places like Singapore. We're kind of seeing that also in places like China and India, right? So as populations age, you need a certain type of care. But on the other hand, in markets where you have very, young populations, we are seeing a different kind of trend. right? People want more devices, they want wearables, they want to body hack, they want to, track their wellness, they want to track their chronic health diseases in a better way. So I think we can see different things in different economies.
Brilliant. So let's move on to Daniel, who is currently Associate Director at the Leapfrog Investment. So your company and you operate at the intersection of finance and public goods in a way. And how are healthcare entrepreneurs in emerging economies turning system constraints such as lack of support, money, and labor forces, and competent engineers, and the kind of necessary setup into business opportunities based on your lots of experience on the ground?
Thanks, Kenji. So very nice to meet everyone today. I'm Daniel. I'm with Leapfrog Investments. Essentially, Leapfrog is a global private equity fund with asset under management of about $3.5 billion. And I think what's interesting is a lot of times with our investments, it's not just commercial returns that we're looking for, but we also focus primarily on the impact that we bring to underserved communities, right? Which is very relevant to Dr. Kenji's question, because a lot of times when we invest into emerging economies, I think funding gaps, talent gaps, I think that's always the top two questions that comes up. But personally, I feel that that perspective is increasingly outdated, and it's also very hard to generalize entire continents like Africa or even entire regions like Southeast Asia, right? Because if you look at pockets or countries within these regions, there are certain countries where these gaps are actually not that pertinent. So for example, right, in Africa and in Southeast Asia, if you look at the population, essentially they are going through a phase of what we call population dividend, where over 60% of the population in Africa is below 25 years old, and over 40% of population in Southeast Asia is below 25 years old. So what that does is you have a very young workforce, people who's able to adapt to technologies very quickly, and that's what's driving digital health forward. Right, so that's on the talent side. Now, on the funding side, and I'm sure Gitali would agree as well, a lot of times when we look at opportunities in healthcare, there's a lot more capital chasing after not enough companies to invest into, especially high quality companies, right? And I think that in itself is really a validation that there is funding. The private sector is very willing to come in and potentially partner with the public sector to make investments into high quality companies. So I think in summary, if I were to just bring this together, both funding gaps, talent gaps, I think this would continue to be narrowed as long as there's alignment across partnerships. This is both public-private partnerships, continued innovation, and most importantly, when investing into emerging markets, as long as the government is willing to increase and improve governance, I think we will continue to see these gaps narrow.
Very interesting. So you gave us some of the very interest perspective of the rising next generation of investors in emerging economies, as well as the population booming. But you are working, you have a company called Leapfrog. So which emerging market is showing signs of leapfrogging? Just to give us an example, how are you de-risking investment in such volatile environment?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, we invest primarily across Southeast Asia, India, and Africa, right? And across the last 5, 10 years, we have seen an evolution of where healthcare is proceeding. I'll give a few examples, and I could broadly characterize this into 3 different trends, right? The first one that we're seeing is healthcare is now being brought closer to the patients. So I'll give you an example. I think one of these opportunity that we're working on in the Philippines right now is within the provinces, right? So it's a chain of hospitals within the provinces. And before there were the concepts of provincial hospitals, if you're someone who's living in the province, it takes you 2 to 3 hours to take a car to the metro to seek treatment and another 2 to 3 hours to go back home, right? So that is a lot of time being spent on the road and may not necessarily be the most productive. And therefore, what we have now focused on is really the provincial areas where we are backing a network of hospitals within the provinces. With our money, what we are going to do is to build more hospitals further out into these underserved communities. And I think importantly, besides hospitals, primary care is extremely important as well. So we're also setting up network of clinics within these provinces so that we can provide access further out into the underserved communities. Right? So that's one trend that we've seen evolved. I think the second trend that we've seen evolved as well across the years is that now in terms of treatment, the agency is no longer on the doctor, but more on the patients, right? It's not just about the doctors taking care of the patients, but the patients should be able to take care of themselves. What that means is instead of perceiving healthcare treatment as episodic, where only when you're sick you see a doctor, it should be perceived as a continuous spectrum, right? And one of our portfolio companies in India called Healthify Me is doing exactly that within the space of preventive health. They've got about 40 million registered users to date. They've just entered the US as well, January 2025, and they're ramping up very quickly as well, right? So essentially what they do is to provide you access to a health coach, dietitian. They track your metabolic health as well. And on top of that, layer on technology, essentially generative AI enabled, which allowed them to scale very quickly. Right, so I think those are some of the key trends that we're seeing in the market.
That's a brilliant point. So I'd like to come back on your remark on, in a sense, democratizing healthcare, particularly shifting the power from doctors to clients. So I'd like to come to that point later. So let's move on to Ms. Genia? Sorry. So who is currently the CEO of the Common Project Foundation? Could you just briefly introduce what this Common Project Foundation is?
Thank you so much, and great to be here. Thank you for Japan government to convene such an exciting conversation about how we can leapfrog innovations. I'm Zhenya Lindgart. As Dr. Shibuya said, I lead the Commons Project Foundation that was formed 6 years ago to fill the gap between the offerings by the governments and innovators in the private sector. Specifically in the area of infrastructure and interoperability. We're talking about healthcare specifically, where good care cannot be provided with good data, especially when the care is delivered remotely via telehealth or digital solutions. And in, of course, many geographies across the world, there is not yet a bolus of digital data. What the Commons Project Foundation focuses is maintaining a tech platform for Android users across the world that allows them to create and maintain longitudinal personal health record, which enables that person-centered health that Daniel talked about, which indeed is a huge megatrend that we will experience ourselves and in our communities for decades to come.
I remember I heard about this project when we were dealing with the vaccine passport.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, so I used to work with James Kondo at the House and Professor Miyata, the Keio University, on this. So for you, I have a few questions, but you have chosen to focus outside traditional innovation hubs, in a sense, right? So primarily focusing on data, but you go beyond the traditional so-called innovation hubs. So why do you believe that the future of health innovation lies in the global south?
It's a great question. And we do split our time in the Western world, in the developed world, and a lot of the emerging future strong economies. Well, it is clear that the need for innovation is present. It is also clear that there are 1,000 flowers blooming in terms of exciting companies that are developing innovative technologies on the ground in a lot of these geographies. Where the dire need is for scaled innovation that can be deployed on a nationwide level and sustainably serve the individuals. What we saw is while it is easier in the United States, in Western Europe, for innovations to scale and stay sustainable and strong through access to capital, access to human resources to advise the companies, it's a lot harder to do that in the emerging markets. And specifically, the markets we are talking about in digital health innovation, we see a lot of pilotitis. There's a lot of exciting solutions that getting innovated, but then all of a sudden they miss a round, they lose a key talent, and they are no longer there serving the community. So what we saw as a huge opportunity is to innovate in the business model of the infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure at the government level. So where we came in is about 3 years ago, started discussing with the government, specifically in Africa, about the opportunity to look at the full healthcare tech stack and build the healthcare tech stack nationally for scalability of these upcoming innovative solutions to support the entrepreneurship, local entrepreneurship ecosystem for scaling. So specifically, we're working with the government of Rwanda and engaged with many governments across Africa because truly Africa leaders, united by Africa CDC, have stepped up to play a major role to structure their Ministry of Health and their technology ministries to support the next 100 years of innovation by taking a strong interest in what data standards are going to be implemented in their country, how to build for interoperability, learning from mistakes of other economies. And I will just use example of the United States, where it took decades to unlock the data from providers and make it available either to health exchanges or to individuals to hold. And for the governments to leapfrog that painful and expensive experience that doesn't work very well still, decades later, and start by ensuring that all of the providers and innovators are adhering to HL7 FHIR data standards, that there are data protection, security available from the get-go, and all of the participants in the healthcare value chain are adhering to the standards, allowing, therefore, for innovation to stay sustainable. And even when technology switches, because it's on the same standard, of course, the records live.
Excellent. I'm very impressed by your work on building tech stack infrastructure, for example, in Rwanda. But how do you build trust around health data in regions with weak digital infrastructure or political instability?
So of course, it's critical to be part of the solution for the countries. In Africa, over the last 3 years, as I traveled around each region and spoke with the ministries of health, there's a very strong sentiment, nothing for us without us. So if you enter the economy and bring funding, bring ideas, it would be short-sighted to think that outsider can come in with all of the solutions. So I think to build trust, it's absolutely critical to come in a supportive, enabling stance. And while sharing best practices from outside, and there are many from Southeast Asia, from other parts of the world, it's a co-creation mode. So that was our key success factor. We continued co-creating with the ministries of health, with the heads of digital transformation, with the major funders, of which we have representatives here on this panel, to make sure that the solution and the business model we present will succeed. And I can maybe talk a little bit about what that business model could be.
Yeah, we'll come back to that point later. So following what you just said about co-development or imagination,
Co-creation.
what about co-creation? I'd like to ask Maria, who is the current founder and co-CEO of FLAIR. So Maria, could you just introduce what you're doing, and then I'd like to pose a few questions for you.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me here. My name is Maria Rabinovich. I'm one of the founders and CEOs of a company called FLAIR. We're also known as Rescue Co., and we are based in Nairobi, Kenya. We started in 2016 by building a tech platform that aggregates available emergency responders for patient transfer services as well as emergency response. We do everything from ambulances to security, air evacuation, and today we are the largest provider of emergency services in East Africa, so we've expanded beyond Kenya. We've conducted tens of thousands of rescues in the region, and we are growing. And I think interesting to note, we have a number of Japanese investors. I think it's definitely been something that we've seen in the market, that people are coming in from different countries interested in investing in the region. But one of our early rounds was led by a Japanese company back in 2018. That's the gist of what we do at FLAIR and Rescue.
Brilliant. So it's a kind of personal question, but what drove your decision to build a life-saving business in Kenya, not in your home country?
Yeah, so I didn't expect to do this at all. My background is in technology, and I came to Kenya on a short-term contract to work for a healthcare company, and it was the first time I had ever worked in healthcare before. And coming from the United States, working in tech, healthcare was never back then. Okay, it's a lot more interesting today, but back then, in about 2013, it was really locked in. A lot of my peers that went into healthcare spent months learning about HIPAA compliance and getting their computers set up for security systems to, be as restrictive as possible, and worked on EMRs. And so I always thought that healthcare is not for me. But I was really curious about the Silicon Savannah, what people were calling the growing tech systems and space in Kenya. And the reason, a big part of that was the innovations that had happened with M-Pesa, their mobile money system, and the leapfrogging that was so famous in that example of a financial tech innovation. And so I was super curious. So when I came to Kenya with this short-term contract, I set up a bunch of meetings and met a lot of people and was wondering if I could contribute in any way to this ecosystem. Met my co-founder, loved the work I was doing, and I was just so inspired. And I think kind of the topic of this panel, it's so true. In the absence of infrastructure and some of the foundational things that can help businesses massively. And yes, it can be so difficult to build without some of these systems, some of like the trained talent in the market, et cetera. At the same time, there's so much opportunity, and it's such an exciting space to be in. And then finally, I think for me, impact was so important. And I think, like everyone's mentioned that here, it was such a good feeling to contribute my tech skills to something that was immediately having an impact on people in the clinic in that first healthcare engagement. So I just decided I have to work in this space. And I didn't know that 2/3 of the world does not have 911. That's not something that growing up in the US you think about or imagine, that in an emergency there's literally no number to call in most of the world. And even if you can call, it can be 3 hours away, as you mentioned. I think the understanding that we had the tools now in place to do something about this was just so exciting for me, and that's how it started.
Excellent. So could you just tell us a little bit about your 911 business model in Kenya? How does it work, and how are you going to monetize this?
Yeah, so when we started, we were just fixated on solving the problem. We didn't know how it would work, but our model in our head was like, okay, this is the Uber for ambulances. Definitely, we can take a small cut of every trip. Currently, people are paying for these trips because there's no public service. But quickly we found out that collections are the worst thing in healthcare, and in emergency services it's even harder. And this is a huge reason why there is no 911 services. So we realized we needed more of a capitation model, like a membership model. And we actually realized that from clients coming to us for our services. So some of our first clients were mobility companies and security companies that said, hey, can you guys cover our staff, and can you deploy an API so that we don't have to call you? We can just put it in our taxi application, press the button, and then it goes to you. So we've kind of really innovated with the inbound clients that came. And this was back in, I think, 2017. We had our first dispatch. In 2017, we went from 0 to 30,000 members. And we hired, went from me being the dispatcher to hiring an actual staff, and I think it was very much market-led innovation in the business. Today we have also some government contracts, and I think, as we were discussing earlier, the government is still the single biggest payer of healthcare in Africa. So it's such a critical partner for us, and obviously everyone thinks emergency services should be a public good. So that's always the question we get, when is the government going to pay for this? And we hope any day now, but the government is incredibly slow, and to your point, it really is hard. as a startup to engage with the government. It takes years and it takes the right skills and the like leverage, I think, in time. So we're working on it. We have some government contracts. They're the most impactful and provide access to the greatest number of people, but they are difficult to come by for now.
Thank you. So I hear from you that still the government is the single most important source of money. But Daniel said there are growing number of private investors across the emerging economy. So one of the biggest challenges in emerging market is the lack of sufficient private investment in healthcare still. So what's the path to making these models financially viable and scalable? I would like to ask every one of you about this question. So shall we start from Jetari, or because you have lots of portfolio, there are success and failures, you have a bunch of governmental or purely public or private, so a bunch of diverse experiences. So based on your knowledge and experiences, what do you think about this issue?
So this is a very common question we get, like that, if you're investing in healthcare companies, how do you make it sustainable? How do you not be dependent always on government funding? Because as you mentioned, government funding comes slow. It's very slow to move, especially in emerging markets. It's tough. So I think when we invest in these markets, we are typically the first institutional investor who comes into these companies. We go into very high risk countries, high risk areas. And I think what we try to do is that because we go into these companies, we essentially mobilize capital from a lot of other international investors and local investors alike. So that's one thing we try to do, to bring in basically private capital into these companies who would have lacked it otherwise. And then we really work with them closely to help them think about how do you get sustainable in the long term. So you shouldn't always be dependent on external capital. Yeah, of course, if you need to grow, you need to raise money. But eventually, how do you make your business model economically viable, where you come up with creative ideas, like how Maria mentioned, you tie up with mobility companies or logistics companies, or like sort of make it a win-win for multiple players in the same value chain, and the model becomes sustainable at a point where you're profitable, and then you can use your own sort of cash and profits to think about other business streams, right? So we do try to make companies think about that.
If I can add, I think in addition to mobilizing funders together to support scaling successful solution with a strong business model, I think there's a great opportunity to set up a different kind of scaling infrastructure that the government and funders could facilitate, where it could lower the barriers to entry of innovators in a particular country. So for example, we are launching in Rwanda a countrywide 12,000 strong network of agents which can bring digital health innovation to the village across the country. And that nationwide scale allows for entrepreneurs to bring in a solution at a much lower cost than standing up their own commercial sales force or distribution set of partnerships. It requires a lot less capital. And of course, requires only one setup cost that can be distributed across the board, and importantly, allows both investors and the government to monitor which investors are picking up steam and allow for scaling of the best performing solutions. And this is where at the nationwide scale, the opportunity, for example, a great innovation in Rwanda and National Health Intelligence Center, which real time shows all of the healthcare transactions that are happening real time across the country, plugging in the performance of innovative solutions into that nationwide performance tracker, for lack of a better term, allows it to be very data driven and support additional investment by funders.
Daniel?
No, I think the points covered by both Gitali and Genya is very relevant, right? Essentially, it's about how businesses should be able to stand on their own 2 feet financially to make it viable for private investors to come in. But I think besides that, something that we have experienced in the past as well is the willingness of the founders to work together. Right? And the reason is because a lot of times when you invest into emerging economies, one thing that is oftentimes lacking is governance. Right? And that is something that we know for sure because governance in an emerging economy definitely cannot be compared to that of a developed nation. However, but with our capital coming in, I think it's important for the founders to realize that they need to be and they need to be willing to work together with the investors to step up their governance. And as that continue to progress, I'm sure the entire funding ecosystem would become a lot more developed, especially in emerging economies. Right? Because governance is oftentimes, I think, the number one issue that we face when investing into emerging economies.
Governance is becoming a global issue, not just the emerging economy. Industrial country have a huge problem in governance anyway. So, any comment?
I think as a founder, I think my perspective is definitely very biased, but I do think fundraising is in healthcare in Africa is incredibly difficult. And that's coming from someone that has connections in the United States, and most of our money has come from. We have also Japanese investors that we met in the market, and we've done really well, relatively speaking. We've been lucky, I would say, but it is incredibly difficult. So I think just new funding pathways are incredibly, everybody's talking about like, what is the new model? What should we be looking for? I think traditional venture capital models have not been working as well as people thought on the continent. So far, there's been a lot of letdowns recently and a lot of conversation around what is the new model. But I actually think like there is, such a low level of risk appetite with investors in emerging markets. And I think the traditional model kind of depends on high risk, risk takers and a ton of investments to see that play out. And you really don't see that, especially in Kenya. The level of due diligence that we had as an early idea stage company from venture, quote unquote, venture capital companies, it was like a private equity investment deal, like they wanted to see our books for the last 4 years when we just, when we're in an idea stage. So I think it's just, it's really, really costly on the founders. And obviously then I totally understand why. There's not an established kind of story about a bunch of exits. So I get why people are skeptical and risk averse. But I do think there's definitely a lack of funding for startups. That's easy to come by, lack of risk appetite, a lack of local investment. It's really hard to find local investors who maybe have more equity in the market and more knowledge, more local knowledge. There's not a lot of that. And I will just end by saying I do totally agree, though, that sustainability is so important, and perhaps there's some logic to traditional models not working, where just growth at all costs was the most valued thing. I do think just proving sustainability, especially in healthcare, is so critical.
How did you pitch the Japanese investors?
Trying to remember.
No, in general, because you seems to be good at doing that.
Well, I know. I don't know. Japanese investors have come to us. We've met them. We met a company called AAIC was our first investor. I'm sure you know them. They're awesome. We were introduced to them by another investor, a U.S. investor. They had just, I think, opened an office in Kenya around the time that they invested. And then I think through them, I think it's a network effect. Like once we knew some of them, they would introduce us. We had a few Japanese angels as well. And I think, just introductions then from existing investors who are opening up shop on the continent.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this kind of forum would be a good place to mingle and get connected. So I would like to shift the focus of the question to more on the technology, which I think some of you are very interested. So what role can, I don't want to say lots of the gizmos, but the AI, blockchain, or telemedicine play in bypassing traditional infrastructure needs in those limited settings? So it's a very common question, but I'd like to ask each one of you about the potential of technologies to democratize healthcare and shift of the power from the providers to consumers. So, anyone?
I'll kick off, but I'm sure all of us
Go ahead.
can contribute. I think the potential is enormous. Of course, AI is improving leaps and bounds. I'm going to focus on that, and of course, more broadly, predictive analytics and LLMs in general, not just AI, agentic AI. But it's clear that if you pick any of the economies this panel participates in, has a challenge of the opening jaws of the population growth, young population growth, and you gave some statistics, Daniel, with physical health center infrastructure with certainty not being able to catch up. In addition to that, the tailwind of the fact that this generation is digital natives. So they already are in phone penetrations and internet penetration and electricity, electrification, and connectivity is improving leaps and bounds. So it's clear that it is through telehealth and digital health that it could become a critical channel for basic triage that right now is inaccessible to most or requires hours of walking towards a nearest health center. So with that opportunity, we are seeing a ton of innovations being put in. Even community health workers, the backbone of health infrastructure in Africa, for example, are being digitized already, obviously with rudimentary infrastructure. So the next step to make AI work for the healthcare system, it is absolutely essential to translate it to local realities. So low bandwidth and low level of healthcare worker education, because of course there needs to be a, so to speak, connector translator in from the patient to AI agent or a diagnostic tool or model. And that, of course, needs critical regulatory framework that doesn't exist anywhere quite yet. So I think that is the component that the most behind that could be the key barrier for adoption of this technology.
Very interesting and excellent comment. Anyone? Daniel?
Yeah, no, I would love to add on as well. I think, in today's context, there's been a lot of buzzwords being thrown around, AI, blockchain, and this and that. But I think what's really important is it comes down to the actual use case, right? And that's something that we focus a lot on our portfolio companies as well. So, case in point, one of our portfolio companies, I spoke about it earlier, is called Healthify Me, based out of India, right? So, digital health, chronic disease management platform. Now, how AI has really helped them, and these are real use cases, is in the past, a fitness coach, for example, would be able to serve 8 users, 8 to 10 users, right? But now with Copilot leveraging generative AI, the same fitness coach is able to serve 40 users, right? So in terms of user base, they are now able to serve 4 times more users by leveraging generative AI. And what this means is that firstly, they can serve more people, providing more access, serving more people in underserved communities. Secondly, from a company's perspective, it allows them to become financially and operationally a lot more productive as well, right? Which goes back to Gitali's point, essentially, a company being able to stand on their own 2 feet. Right, so I think the use case in itself is important, and we are seeing that being leveraged well in some of these healthcare companies that we're investing into.
Great. So, any comment from IOC front?
Yeah, actually, technology is playing a very crucial role in healthcare globally, and we can see it across our portfolio as well. And the ones who lack it will be left behind, honestly. So, every company needs to think about how they implement the technology in their companies, right? So, right from, I mean, we have portfolio companies which are using agentic AI for, let's say, even call center management, questions from patients. If they, 70-80% of use cases are actually just primary in nature and, like basic questions. So how do you free up the doctor's time by, let's say, having, a sort of AI platform which can actually answer the more basic questions, right? So as simple as that, to actually having platforms. So we have a couple of companies in our portfolio which data is so dispersed, right? So the healthcare providers have certain data, the insurance companies have certain data, the pharma company has another set of data. How do you sort of put all this data together, right? So how do you kind of carry around your own electronic medical record on your phone, like you were talking about, and then have all your medical history there. So no matter who you go to, all that data is there on a blockchain or whatever that format might be, to be able to show it to multiple providers in the same value chain. That's something we can see is happening very fast, very quickly, and especially in emerging markets because there's just so much data that is dispersed.
Very good. Maria, based on your example in Kenya, what do you see about the future of this technological application?
We've already, so at our company, we've already seen it massively change our operations internally. We're a tech-led, product-led company, so I agree with everything the examples you gave are so relevant to us. It's a call center. There's a bunch of standard triage and questions that we handle that are perfect use cases for using this new technology. I think for us, for dispatch centers in general and emergency response, one of the key things for sustainability, and this is the same globally, is what in our context I call light footprint expansion. So we need to be able to spread our services, but we don't want to exponentially increase the size of our dispatch center. So we need to really intelligently optimize because you need a surplus of people for those spikes in emergency cases. But you can't do that in every location that you operate in. So the more you can centralize and make this dispatch center scalable, the more sustainable you will be. And I think for us, the obvious use case there and what we're experimenting with now is this triage agent assistance and as well as translation for local dialects. We have thousands of different languages throughout the continent. If we want to provide our services at scale from a central location, we really need language support, and so we're experimenting with that at the moment. But yeah, agree with somebody said earlier, like it really just depends on the use case, it does depend on the use case, but there are just so many examples in which, and the last most obvious one is how much it's increased our development speed on the tech side.
Very encouraging. Thank you. I'd like to give for the opportunity to speak out or ask us one, two questions. Before that, I'd like to touch upon one sensitive issue about geopolitical tensions. So the term global south or emerging economy is increasingly loaded, not just at developmental level, but as a geopolitical signal, sometimes seen as a counterweight to the so-called US-led world order. In this shifting landscape, how are geopolitical tensions, such as US-China rivalry, regional power realignments, or even non-aligned movements, along shaping investment flows and partnership strategies in emerging economies? You don't have to worry too much about political correctness, but I would like to hear from you, from an investor's perspective, how are you going to deal with it? What are your future prospect on this issue?
So maybe I can start. So actually we can see that, so healthcare is a very local, it's a very local homegrown sort of problem, right? So it's not actually cross-border or international in a large way because every economy has to deal with their own healthcare problems. What we can see is at least on the medical device side, very interestingly, and even on like drug delivery, pharmaceuticals, a lot is becoming local. So like in India, for instance, almost everything is being made locally now. It's not China made, getting imported into India, which has actually spurred a lot of employment. It's spurred a lot of innovation. We can see very unique technologies. Like we have an underlying portfolio company which creates this sort of mat that you put under an ICU bed, and it can track all your vitals in real time, thus reducing the dependency on, let's say, nurses or medical care who needs to come into your room every 30 minutes to check you. And then it's also reduced like falls. It's reduced emergencies where patients could go into a critical condition. So, and that was fully made in India, right? This entire mat that was created. So we can see a lot more innovation. I think it's been, I wouldn't say use the word positive, but it's been a great opportunity.
Yeah, no, I would like to chime in here as well, maybe just building on what Kitali has mentioned. Interestingly, adding across the years, what I have observed is that especially in emerging economies, they are trying to be a little, basically trying to be more independent and focusing more on domestic economies, right? And with this recent geopolitical tensions, I think that process has now been expedited. So, for example, one of the countries that we look quite heavily into would be Vietnam. And I'm sure most of you would know Vietnam is hit by one of the highest rate of tariffs from the US, right? Almost 40%. But again, what's interesting is if you look at the domestic economy in Vietnam, it remains very resilient. GDP growth continues to be at 7-8%. If you look at retail sales growth, the latest data that came up, they are still at 10 to 11%, right? So what this shows is, especially within healthcare, I would assume it's a lot more resilient as compared to other sectors. But outside of healthcare, just general consumption, for example, right? It remains extremely strong, even in domestic economies.
Very good. Anybody else?
I will just add that practically what's been happening in the last decade, I would say, made the job of ministries of health, geopolitical tensions and specifically, their job a little bit more difficult because they do face a lot of inbound interest for collaboration, investments in infrastructure by one nation, and then potentially needing to move to a duplicative infrastructure by another nation. And of course, that requires a lot of retraining, repositioning, and sometimes delays, frankly, the implementation of innovation. So in the future, of course, cross-national collaboration, perhaps facilitated by the multinational investors, would only make their very tough job easier.
Brilliant. Maria, if you have it.
It's such a big question, and I'm not sure how much I can really add, except to say that it's a fascinating one. Living in Kenya, I will say there's a huge, what they're calling the scramble for Africa, which is, or neocolonialism, however you want to look at it. There's a massive influx of Chinese influence and infrastructure investments. At the same time, there's a huge influence from the US in terms of military support and training and influence, really. And so I think it's such an important kind of ground for that, the continent in general. And I'm really curious to see how it plays out and hope for the best for everyone.
Thank you. So I'll take one or two questions from the floor, if any. Okay. Any mic? Please identify yourself and make your question brief.
Nice to meet you. My name is Masakazu, CEO of the Smile Club, is a methodic start company in Japan, and we focus on the children healthcare sector. And of course, our solution want to go to expand the emerging market. But most support in Japan focusing on the United States or the Europe because it's a big market. But we hope to the emerging market and solve the issues you talk about. So, but could you give some advice for Japanese start company to enter the emerging country more?
So you're asking each one of them to give you a brief advice?
Yeah, give me advice.
If any.
Financial and entry.
Oh, yeah. Who will go first?
My advice would be just to start, like just go there. I'm really speaking from my own experience, and I think there's just so much that you have to learn. I guess what I will say would be the defining experience that I hear the most from other founders would be scope creep. And I don't know if it's the same here, but when I was working in the US before, I worked with several startups, and the mantra from investors was focus. Know what you're doing, do one thing really, really well, and that's the only way to succeed. And people that are unfocused, we're not investing in them, that never works. But that's a lot harder to do when you're working in an environment or an ecosystem where those other things that you might need for your product to succeed or your customers to grow are not there at the level that you need them at. And so what we've seen, especially in healthcare, is like a healthcare company becoming their own supply chain manager, or figuring out delivery, or training is a big one. And you start to do all these things that traditionally early on, I was like, this is scope creep. It's bad. We have to be focused. And it just keeps coming back again and again. And it's the one thing that I've heard is like, understand the ecosystem and what you'll need, and be willing to potentially participate in the development of some of the peripheral things that are required for you to succeed. Yeah.
Brilliant.
My advice would be try to plug into existing infrastructure. So, for example, when we came into a country and approached the ministries or the different players already in the field, we realized there are many resources available for new entrants for leverage. So, for example, local training resources. There are training centers to be leveraged, plugging into the community health infrastructure to deliver your services, even for maybe showing up first in one district and then growing from there. But they will help you overcome this massive barrier of understanding how it works in that local market, which is very, very different, sometimes even from district to district in one country, but let alone across countries. That will help you scale that learning curve.
My 2 cents would be you cannot copy paste what works in a developed market in an emerging market. That is a complete recipe for failure. So you have to know the local nuances, local challenges, local people, very, very critical. I mean, I remember a decade ago, I went to the Philippines. They said we don't even have 50 radiologists, right? Or like in Indonesia, they don't even have more than 3 cardiologists. So there are different challenges in every market. And so you have to build a business around that challenge.
Daniel? No?
No, I think the panelists have covered it mostly, right? I think essentially just be very, very mindful of cultural nuances. Whatever's working in Japan, in the US, in Europe may not necessarily work in emerging markets. And even within emerging markets, what's working in Vietnam may not apply to Philippines. And even within the countries, right, districts by districts, I think Zenya has mentioned, it's very different as well. So I think, as an initial entry, what would be important is to find a strong local partner as well, someone who is there and able to show you the ropes. I think that would be a very key piece of the puzzle for you.
Yeah, you see all these excellent investors and also practitioners on the grounds. So you should be empowered by their presence, first of all. One more question, if you any, please.
So good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Samaresh, and I am a practicing ophthalmologist in India. But we also run a company that does humanitarian work and outreach work across Francophone Africa. So this question is for Ms. Zengia. Specifically, we've since 2019 been screening diabetes and doing pediatric screening for school children for eye diseases and stuff. And we face 2 specific challenges. One, network connectivity issue, which makes it very difficult to deploy AI on the ground and to pick up people because we don't have that many doctors. And second is the sensitivity of the local governments to data being put up on the cloud because they don't want anything going up on the cloud and all being in the local area. So how are you combating this situation?
Great question. And on the first, the network connectivity, I mentioned that's one of the critical challenges everywhere. I have seen very interesting business models pop up where putting in network connectivity, building it into the community for broader use, even though it catalyzes accessibility to digital health, but can be used for other purposes, of course, broadly for the community. So getting it paid for by the investment getting paid on a long term by other services, but then enabling healthcare. So being plugged in, I imagine you have a nonprofit organization doing this work, but getting plugged into a lot of the efforts by Africa CDC specifically that is championing a lot of these region-wide, Francophone Africa, East Africa, opportunities to put in the infrastructure, get it paid for by all of the sectors, but benefiting first and foremost to healthcare. That would be my first advice, and happy to connect you. And then second, on a cloud, yes, we've heard those challenges in many other non-emerging markets, but there, indeed, that's why I mentioned data centers. That's a big one for the geopolitical. That's the first infrastructure that was put in place by one nation and then rebuilt by another nation. That is just requires, I think, time for comfort for now, I think it does need to live within the national boundaries, unfortunately. So there's no way around sort of yet that I've found to get comfort level with the cloud. But I know it will come.
Because we do retinal scans, and retinal scans, according to them, are biometric data. And so it's just impossible to do AI on that.
Completely. I know it will come, but showing the outcomes of your work, and I know that screening school children for diseases is a big priority for many governments and ministries of health. Those use cases and the outcomes that they create for the productivity of their workforce decades from now will certainly be an argument to bring to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw one more, lady there. Can you just make it brief? We are running out of time.
Good morning. Ohayo gozaimasu. My name is Jolyn Lim. I'm from Singapore, but I used to live in the United States for 20 plus years. So I have questions for Ms. Zenia. So we're talking about emerging markets. Seems like we are all focusing on Africa. Africa is a very big region. If I'm not wrong, the highest GDP raised is in South Africa. And Kenya is probably one of the fifth or something. So I'd like you to conclude and help me to understand, in the whole Africa region, who are the top 3 countries are much more needed in healthcare and its application? Well, let's leave the data center aside because that issue hasn't been solved within Asia-Pac yet. So thank you.
So just to repeat the question, you're asking for what are the top 3 countries most ready to accept innovations?
Yes, more of maybe top medical technology companies, products, or even trying to make medicine accessible to all the average African.
I need to be cautious with what I say because, of course, I would love for all 50 countries on the continent to benefit from innovations arriving at the continent. I would first say that each region is incredibly different. Francophone Africa is phenomenally different from East Africa. I think in each region there are nations that are leading the pack, so to speak, and in each region there are cross-regional collaboratives that is very, very important to plug into, like EAC, for example, in East Africa. Same exists in Francophone, Central, and SADC. So I would suggest engaging with them and helping and asking them to prioritize which countries they would support to introduce the innovations and then ask for their support to then scale it across their region. That will allow you not only put the question on the governments themselves and have them decide and volunteer somebody who would be committed, supported by their peers, but then also start thinking about scaling your technology. So my advice would be pick one out of the top 3 largest cooperatives of nations within Africa so that you cover 3 regions out of 5 and go from there.
Great. So we are running out of time. So I would like to close the session here today. But I'd like to, please, let's give a big round of applause to our panelists who are fantastic. Thank you.
And please join me in thanking our moderator, Dr. Shibuya. Thank you very much for that insightful discussion.